walls of an old house, a scream that didn't sound human. It was a guttural mix of a human wail and an animalistic roar. For anyone who heard it, time seemed to stand still, as if the world itself had shuddered. Inside that house, Margaret sat on the floor, her eyes wide and tears streaming down her face. Before her lay the body of her husband, John. But something was horribly wrong. The corpse wasn't whole. His upper half was mangled, torn apart by massive teeth, while his lower half had vanished entirely, as if something had just swallowed it whole. the scream that started it all. But amidst the collapse and the terror, there was one thing she still didn't get. Why was her husband's body torn that way? Why was the other half gone? And why did the shadow make her look at it before everything began? Questions with no answers.
By dawn, the city was still blanketed in shadow. The sun didn't rise. The sky had turned into a black veil. No stars, no light, just thick clouds moving slowly, hiding something behind them. At the police station, Officer Richard was flooded with reports of strange noises and red-eyed children in the streets. He didn't believe it at first, figured it was some kind of mass hysteria, but when he looked out his office window, he saw the unthinkable. The street was packed with dozens of children. They stood perfectly still, faces expressionless, eyes glowing red. Behind them, the shadow was stretching, snaking between buildings and coiling around lampposts, swallowing everything in its path. Richard grabbed his radio, trying to reach other patrols, but all he got was static and strange whispers. Whispers speaking gibberish, but carrying a clear message. It was over. Just then, Elizabeth, a young journalist looking for a scoop, burst into the office. She was trembling. I saw them. The children, and a woman in an old house. She was screaming next to a mutilated body. Richard froze. Elizabeth's story matched the first 911 call he'd received. Margaret's house, the body, the shadow. He didn't understand how one body could trigger all this, but he felt a hidden connection. Richard decided to go see for himself. He grabbed his service weapon and told Elizabeth to come along. Despite her fear, she agreed. She felt this was bigger than a news story. It was a curse that needed a witness. As they approached Margaret's house, the street was empty except for the children. They stood in long rows like sentries. They didn't move, but their eyes followed every step the two took. Richard raised his gun, his hand shaking. It wasn't normal fear. It was the realization that a gun wouldn't do a damn thing. But he held on to it anyway. It was all he had. Elizabeth grabbed his arm. Look, the door is open. Indeed, the front door was wide open, and darkness was pouring out of it like thick smoke. They stepped inside cautiously. The house was filled with a low moaning, like the sound of wind, but it was coming from the walls themselves, like the house was breathing. In the middle of the room, Margaret was still on the floor, eyes wide. The shadow was coiled around her. She wasn't screaming anymore. She was whispering incantations. Richard approached her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. She just pointed a shaking hand toward John's mangled remains. Elizabeth gasped and looked away, but she noticed something impossible. The body wasn't still. It was twitching, as if it were still alive. The torn flesh was shuddering, like something was trying to claw its way out from the inside. Richard backed up. He realized the body wasn't just remains. It was a key. But a key to what? The shadow let out a deep laugh. It has begun, and it will not stop. Suddenly, the ground surged, walls cracked, and furniture began to fly. The children outside began chanting in a language no one understood, their voices perfectly in sync. Margaret finally looked up at Richard and Elizabeth. Her voice was a raspy ghost of itself. It isn't death, it's a birth. Elizabeth realized then that the mangled corpse wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something being born from the dark. At that moment, John's torso split wide open. A thick black smoke billowed out, rising to the ceiling and forming a massive, featureless face with two glowing ember eyes. The shadow smirked. There are many witnesses, but only one vessel. It looked straight at Margaret. Margaret closed her eyes, but the words kept coming. She began chanting things she'd never heard, as if they'd been etched into her brain since the dawn of time. Elizabeth grabbed Richard's hand. We have to get out of here, now! But the door slammed shut. The children outside began to close in, their eyes burning brighter. Richard raised his gun again and fired. The bullet streaked through the air and vanished into the shadow as if it never existed. The shadow laughed. Weapons are useless. Only the words are the key. Margaret stopped chanting and looked at them. It wants to be born again. It wants to use us. It wants to use all of America. Richard felt the floor beneath him turn soft, like the house was rejecting him. Then a faint voice came from the mangled corpse. It was John's voice, whispering one word over and over: birth. The shadow's laughter roared. Outside, the children began stomping their feet in a rhythmic, demonic beat. With each laughter roared. Outside, the children began stomping their feet in a rhythmic, demonic beat. With each laughter roared. Outside, the children began stomping their feet in a rhythmic, demonic beat. Makes him stronger. Elizabeth gripped Richard's arm. We have to find another way, not weapons, words. The shadow leaned towards Elizabeth. You are a witness too, but you are not the vessel. Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. She realized Margaret was the key, and the body was part of a ritual that wasn't finished yet. Suddenly, a child walked through the door holding a torn doll. He wasn't just a kid. His face was distorted, his eyes glowing fiercer than the rest. He placed the doll next to the corpse. Margaret realized then that the doll was a symbol, a catalyst for whatever was being born. The shadow gestured towards the child, and the corpse began to thrash. A sound erupted from the torn torso, a scream from another world. It's happening, Elizabeth cried. It's being born right now. Margaret collapsed, sobbing, but she couldn't look away. The shadow forced her to watch. Outside, the children's chanting reached a fever pitch. Richard felt like he recognized the language, as if it was buried in a collective Amic memory he didn't know he had. This is the beginning, the shadow hissed. The one we've waited for centuries. Margaret looked at Elizabeth. He wants to use every witness as a vessel, but there's a way, only one way. What is it? Elizabeth begged. Margaret whispered. The words, the old words, they're the only thing that can close it. Richard realized the mangled corpse was the seed of this catastrophe. The house shook with such force that windows exploded and cars outside flipped over. The shadow looked up. It has begun. We have to close the ritual, Margaret screamed. How? Elizabeth cried. Margaret looked at the body. The other half, the missing half, it's the anchor. If we find it, we can stop him. Richard gasped. The disappearance of the lower half wasn't random. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. Finding it was their only shot.
The entire city was now consumed by the void. No sun, no moon, just a moving black sky. Richard and Elizabeth was still trapped with Margaret as the shadow coiled tighter. The rhythmic stomping outside was deafening. Margaret's eyes glowed with a mix of fear and surrender. If we don't find the whole body, he will be born in full, and he will swallow everything. Richard felt the house was hiding something. Suddenly, a wall in the back of the house crumbled, revealing a secret passage. A deep voice echoed from within. The other half waits in the depths of the earth. We have to go, now, Margaret yelled. They struggled out of the house. The children didn't stop them. They just watched. The city was a living nightmare. People stood like statues in the streets, red eyes glowing. Richard led them toward the old church downtown. If the other half is anywhere, it's there. That's the only place the bells are still ringing. When they arrived, the doors were wide. Inside was pitch black, but the bell was tolling with a fury, resisting the shadow. They found it under the altar, John's lower half. It was twitching, just like the rest. Margaret collapsed. This is it. If the halves unite, the entity will be complete. We have to stop it. The shadow rose within the church, covering the walls. You found it, but you won't stop it. Richard didn't reach for his gun this time. He knew better. Margaret began to chant the old words. They were ancient, powerful. The shadow shrieked, trying to drown her out, but the church bell let out a massive toll that broke the silence and gave her strength. The lower half thrashed, black smoke pouring out, trying to reach for the upper half. "No!" Margaret screamed. "If they touch, it's over." Elizabeth held her hand. "Keep going, the words." Margaret's voice rose to a shout. With every word, the shadow recoiled. Suddenly, the children flooded into the church, chanting a counterspell to ruin the ritual. The air became unbreathable. The altar began to split. Richard looked around, knowing the end was seconds away. It was either Margaret or the entity. In one final moment, the bell gave one last earth-shattering toll. It drowned out the children's voices, giving Margaret the opening to scream the final word. The shadow let out a world-ending roar. The church shook to its foundations, and then it began